Hello, builders. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever time you're listening to this, wherever you're listening to this, we welcome you to the Build Your Success podcast. Here at the Build Your Success podcast, we like to build you so you can build others. We do that through our corporate training events, speaking events, and workshops. And we also do that with some special guests on the podcast. I'm grateful today to have Major General John Gronski. He's a retired U.S. Army veteran, and he's the author of the book Iron-Sharpened Leadership and The Ride of Our Lives. We'll talk about both those books in the podcast, but he's a leadership consultant, international speaker, and an executive coach. John serves as CEO of Leader Grove LLC. He's a non-resident senior fellow with the Transatlantic Leadership Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. So welcome to the podcast, David, but let me just get this in there. Thank you for your service to our country, John.
Brian, I appreciate you saying that. And I also appreciate you hosting me on your podcast. It's a great program you put together. I'm glad to join you today.
I appreciate you being here. And this podcast, we have a lot of fun here. We learn a lot of lessons from our guests, and I'm just grateful to share some wonderful people with the listeners to this podcast.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Awesome, John. Well, listen, I'm going to ask you the question we ask all of our guests. What does leadership and being a leader mean to John Gronski?
Yeah, Brian, it really comes down to my leadership philosophy of character, leader competence, and resilience. And I really think character is the foundational element of leadership. And, having that strong character, having those values that you live by and make decisions in accordance with those values. And then, the leader competence which is really all about, providing vision, purpose, being able to communicate, having the courage to make decisions. And then resiliency, which is not only the ability to overcome adversity, but also the fortitude to be the best person you could be.
Wow. Yeah, that is phenomenal. This character. I made a post on LinkedIn today. A friend of mine, Max Story, has this saying that you can't have base camp leadership and get to the top of the mountain. And you can't have base camp character and get to the top of the mountain. So I think that character is so important in all that we do in our life. You also talked about sharing a vision with others and the courage to make decisions. That's so important. So, John, you've been around a lot of leaders. You've been a leader in the military, and now you work with organizations. Can you give us an example of a leader? And you don't have to say a name, but just how a leader has done these things, been this character model, and had the courage to make decisions.
Yeah, I think a great example is a great American who passed away several weeks ago, Colin Powell. Colin Powell, in my view, was absolutely a character-based leader. He lived his life in accordance with his own personal core values and our Army values. And then he also spoke and wrote a lot about having the courage to make decisions with less than perfect information. And I think as we reflect on any leader who's out there listening to the program, reflecting on their decision-making history and capability, I think everybody would agree, we never have perfect information when we make decisions. And Colin Powell spoke a lot about having to have the courage to rise above that uncertainty and make those decisions, and then being able to adjust from the decisions that we make.
Yeah, I have to agree with Colin. Sometimes we don't have all the answers when we have to make a decision, and perfection is paralyzing. And if you don't make a decision, things are going to go on without you. If you can't make decisions and important decisions, you need to consider the information. I agree, but use what information you have and move forward.
Yeah, and Brian, Colin Powell talked about the 40-70 rule, and he said, if a leader makes a decision with less than 40% of the information, you're just guessing, you're just shooting from the hip. So you do have to acquire, at least 40% of the information. But then he said, if you wait until you have more than 70% of the information, you probably missed an opportunity. So you've got to get comfortable with making those decisions with between 40 and 70% of the information available.
I like that 40-70 rule. It reminds me, I've been in construction for the last 26 years, and a lot of times drawings are not complete. I mean, they intentionally start a job without complete drawings. And I'll have to agree with Colin. If they're 40% complete, you got a disaster on your hands. But if they are 70% complete, you can get going and start in a forward movement while they're finishing up, and even be able to change and modify now that you have progressed and done some things. You realize, well, maybe that won't work. And so I think having that ability to be flexible and get started is good.
No, absolutely. And Brian, being in business yourself, business moves at a very high rate of speed. And if we procrastinate, or if we fail to make decisions when decisions need to be made, we miss those opportunities that are out there. And you're right. Once we make a decision, we don't just walk away from it. We stay connected to it. We're prepared to adapt and adjust on those decisions we made as we get more information available, or as the situation becomes more clear. So it's not just about making a decision and giving a task to the folks that work for you and walking away from it. Leaders have to stay connected so they could provide additional guidance and adjust as needed.
Yeah. I think this is a great segue, talking about adjusting as needed. You wrote the book Ride of Our Lives. I had the privilege of reading that book. It's an outstanding book. I feel like I rode with you across the United States. I don't have the stamina to do that, but through the book and seeing what the challenges that you faced, not only did you rode across the country, but you took your wife. And how old was your son at the time?
Yeah, he was 15 months old when we started that 3-month-long trip.
So you learned a lot of lessons during this trip. Give our listeners just a few tidbits on that experience.
Yeah, and again, this was back in 1983 when my wife and I conducted this trip. I had spent 4 years in the Army at that point, and I actually left the Army. I had a break in service for about a year. So I, living out on the West Coast in Washington State, decided to move back to northeastern Pennsylvania. And I suggested to my wife that we fulfill a longtime dream I had of bicycling across the United States. And we didn't see our 15-month-old son, Stephen, as a hindrance or an obstacle. We saw him as just a great way to spend some quality family time together on this journey that we took. So, I pulled Stephen across the United States in a trailer. And I think one of the lessons I learned on the trip, and it kind of gets back into making decisions, is that, sometimes we came to a crossroads on that trip, both literally and figuratively. And we had to make a decision, do we go north or south? Which direction do we head in? And I learned that whatever decision you make, as long as you go into that decision with the proper attitude, it's never a wrong decision. And as you know, as our life progresses, we make many life decisions, many career decisions. And I believe that we should always be forward looking and not backward looking. And as long as, again, we go in with the right attitude, prepare to adjust if you need to, based on what is up ahead on that road as you make that decision to travel that path, you're going to be in good shape. But for those people who make decisions and they're always commiserating and have buyer's remorse and always look, oh, what if I made the other decision? It doesn't matter. You make those decisions, you go into on that route with the right attitude, and you're going to be good to go. The other lesson is life is a team sport. And that, my other book, Iron-Sharpened Leadership, it's all based on Proverbs 27:17, which is the Bible verse that states, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. And again, myself, my wife, Bertie, our son, Stephen, even though he was only 15 months old, he kept my wife and I sharp on that trip. And again, it's just all about understanding life is a team endeavor, and you have to strive to reach your hand up to mentors and coaches so you can become a stronger person. But then at the same time, you've got to be able to reach your hand down to help other people who might not be as talented as you are, so you could help them along the way too. So those are some of the things I learned on that magnificent journey that we took back in 1983.
John, I enjoyed the book, and I also read Walk Across America. So I'd encourage listeners to read that book as well. But one thing that you talked about a team and your wife and your son being part of that, but also the people that helped you along the journey. Uh, that, that amazed me about both books, Walk Across America and Ride Across America, were dependent upon good-natured people, people that were helping inspire people. And you met some people along the route that weren't as friendly, but to realize there's good human beings out there that want to help each other. I also love in your book about your wife seeing your son every day for hours upon end. That beautiful image in my mind. I have 4 children. I can imagine that was probably a great thing as well. But just people helping people, as you mentioned, reaching down to others, and those experiences that you had across the United States.
Yeah, and Brian, you make a good point there about allowing yourself to be helped by other people. And we've got a lot of people struggling today with emotional issues and mental health issues and all of that. A lot of it because of the uncertainty of the pandemic and then other forces that are out there. And the coaching I give to people is don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't think that you could do everything on your own. It's okay to ask somebody for a little bit of help when you need it. And I think we learned that on our bicycle adventure, that there were plenty of people out there who opened up their doors to us and allowed us to maybe spend a night at their house or allowed us to camp in their backyard. And sometimes, somebody would buy us lunch. And it was just a great way to see that there are so many nice, caring people out there, and we just have to open up our hearts to them. And then again, at the same time, we have to allow ourselves to be generous to help other people who may need a helping hand from us as well.
Yeah, that sounds like that paying it forward thing. And not, here we are when we're doing this recording, we're in the holiday times. It's going to actually go up after the first year, but not only during holiday times, but in the year round, but just have a life of giving to others and helping others.
Yeah, just that whole attitude of being generous and of being kind. And my father, he only had a 7th grade education, and he developed a large business in northeastern Pennsylvania where I grew up. And one of the things he taught me as I was a young child growing up is you've got to be generous. And he used to say, the more generosity you put forth, the more good things are going to happen to you in your life. It's like that whole aspect of karma. And I really learned from my father, it was important to be generous. It was important to help other people. And although you don't do it, for transactional reasons, good things do happen to you when you try to be good to other people.
That's wonderful, John. Listen, for the listeners, I have an application process for my guests, and they fill out an application. Feel free to do that when you want to be a guest or you want to recommend a guest. Send them to this application process at buildcs.net. But I want to highlight something that goes perfectly here. One of the things you put in your application is the secret and leadership ingredient is care. I don't think that can be said enough. I'm going to say it again. In fact, secret and leadership ingredient is care. It sounds like you learned that from your father. I'm sure you learned it from other people over time. Unpack that for us.
Yeah, I think there's a few different aspects there. First of all, a leader has to care for themselves. I like to say you've got to put firewood on your own campfire before it's going to cast light. So you've got to develop yourself, and you've got to take care of yourself in order for you to care for those you lead. So that's one of the aspects of that. And then I've also found that the simple things we do for our followers, for our employees, however you want to frame that, the simple thing we do for those who follow us. It might be simple in our mind, but it's such a big thing in the minds of the people we do it for. And, I remember right after 9/11, I had to take 2,000 soldiers over to Europe to do a force protection mission on U.S. installations over there, because, again, it was right after 9/11. We didn't know if terrorists were going to attack U.S. bases in Europe or not. And one thing I did is I have 2,000 soldiers spread over 4 countries: Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And I would be on the road a lot, visiting those soldiers, making sure they had all the things they needed. And one thing I did is I was visiting these soldiers. I would have my assistant take a picture of me and the soldier, and then I would ask the soldier what loved one they would want me to send that picture to back home. And some people would say, my spouse, or others would say my daughter, my son, my mother, my father, whomever. And I would get the name and address of that loved one. And then when we got the pictures developed, and this is before digital cameras, so these were analog pictures we had to get developed. And then I would write a handwritten note to that soldier's loved one, telling the family member back home what a great job the soldier was doing, how proud they could be of their soldier. And you know what, Brian? 10 years after that, 12 years after that, I would have soldiers walking up to me, thanking me for the fact that I sent that picture back home. Or I would have family members meet me at a dinner or some other event, and they would thank me for sending that picture home. And again, this is over a dozen years later after the fact. They would still be thanking me for that. And again, it was just a little thing I did. I never thought it was anything, that monumental, but it was a big thing in their minds. So again, as leaders, if we could find ways to show people that we lead, that we really truly care about them, it's just going to have a great effect for years and years to come.
Oh, John, that is a great message. I hear about the care not only for the soldier, but recognizing the family, because the families of soldiers make so many sacrifices. They give that person to the service of a country, and to know you recognize the person, but also sent something that was just so valuable to their loved one. It's a win-win. And like you said, it looks and sounds simple. However, you took the time to do it. And not everybody does, to do some simple thing. I love writing thank you cards. It's just a blast. When I write it, it feels good. Whether or not the person responds to it or not, okay. But as long as you get to do that, and I think I think in the leadership arena, everybody's trying to do the next big thing. And if we could do a bunch of small collective things that would turn into something big, I think we would have more success with that.
Yeah, Brian. The funny thing, just a couple of days ago, earlier this week, I was talking to a group of CEOs from the Philadelphia region, and we were talking about this whole concept of care. And then at the end of the 2-hour session I did with them, I asked, "Hey, how are you going to apply these things in your life going forward now, or how have you applied them?" And one of the CEOs said, "Hey, I've already applied what you talked about regarding care." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He goes, "Well, on a break, I was thinking, based on what you said about caring for our workers or caring for our followers." He goes, when we're done with a job, we would always send a little gift package to the customer, thanking them, for allowing us to serve them." And he said, I thought to myself, why aren't we also sending a little gift package to the employees who took care of that customer? So he said, during one of the breaks, he goes, I texted my headquarters, back home, and I told them to not only send a gift package out to the job that we just completed to the customer, but also send a gift package out to the 4 or 5 people who worked on that job. And it was just like so great to hear that this leader was applying something we talked about so quickly, so he could have a more successful organization, and just showed people that he really cared about them.
That's amazing. And that's that making decisions, making decisions now. Hey, you heard something sounds good. If you don't take action, now is what I've learned for myself. If I didn't take action when I learned that lesson, then I'm going to forget it 2 days later. I'm trying to think of the word I want to use here. The big momentum has lost. You go to a leadership event, you hear something great. If you don't write it down and take action on it, it's going to go in a folder somewhere and you're going to forget it. So that's good. Well, John, it's time to start wrapping things up on the podcast here. I'm going to bring up your website for those that are watching on YouTube. For those that are listening, it's johngronski.com. We'll also include that in the show notes. But John, tell our listeners what they can find there, and also tell us about your latest book.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff they could find on my website. I've been on first of all, this is one of the best podcasts I've been on. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you. Your podcast will be on my website along with many others that I have been on. I have a periodic leadership email that I send out to people, so folks could register for that free leadership email. They could download a free leadership pamphlet, which talks about, or which kind of goes into depth on some of the stuff we talked about today. And they could have access to my YouTube channel, my social media site. So it's a great way to stay connected with me. And then, of course, they could find out more about the two books you mentioned. The Ride of Our Lives, which is a story about this bicycle adventure I took back in 1983 with my wife, Barry, and our 15-month-old son, Stephen. And then my most recent book, Iron-Sharpened Leadership, which really covers my leadership philosophy of character, leader competence, and resilience. So you can find all of that stuff there. And I hope people will take advantage of it.
Well, thank you, John. Thanks for being a guest on the podcast today. For our listeners, again, I will include all of that in the show notes. You can find those things and check John out. Get those free things he's offering to you. I'd also encourage you to go to our website, buildcs.net. You can see the programs we're offering. You can also download active listening tips from us and get a free download for that. So thanks for listening to the podcast today. Remember to build yourself and then build others.